For joining us on our call for community solutions hosted by the Forbes Funds. Today, our guest speaker is actually coming from in-house. We're going to be joined in just a moment by Fred Brown, who's the president and CEO of the Forbes Funds, and we have some exciting updates related to our present work that we'll be sharing first in a presentation from Fred, but then he and I are going to have a bit of a conversation going into some of the priorities of that work and what we're really looking forward to. So as many of you know, the calls for community solutions have been hosted since March of 2020 as a place to share resources and updates from nonprofits to the larger ecosystem throughout Southwest PA, statewide, globally, and beyond the nonprofit sector itself. We're really looking to create cross-sector, two-generation partnerships to this work to make sure that we're getting diverse perspectives and understanding the short and long-term community needs during this time. We have hosted 5,150 calls with 43,992 participants since March of 2020. We have three frameworks and ways that the Forbes Funds operates. The first is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which have been adopted by multiple cities and countries globally as ways to share metrics and use common language for bringing organizations and individuals doing social impact work together. The second framework is this social determinants of health, and this is used a little bit more frequently, I would say locally, as a way to group organizations that are doing very similar work. And I know Foundation Directory Online and some of their grant writing resources has a, what sustainable develop or social determinant of health are you? And you can kind of copy and paste your language into the app and it'll tell you, this aligns most closely with healthcare access and quality. But again, it's just a little bit broader buckets and ways of grouping work together as a framework of collaboration. And then the 8 R's internally are the operational how of the Forbes Funds. And so when we talk about how we're really moving the needle on economic stability and what's being done in the region of Southwest PA, there are a lot of different ways to measure success in terms of metrics, but so much of what people share in conference presentations or, as we're building partnerships is the journey of how those metrics are reached. And so that's what the 8 R's really seeks to capture. Was this a change in equity and access? Was it a change to, bringing more perspectives or eligible individuals to receive this specific service that made the change? Was it a return on policy? Was there, better education for our elected officials that resulted in them voting differently or sponsoring a bill or a study that changed how we've invested time and money into this? Or was it a return on relationships? Was it something that, the organizations that have been working on this together in terms of building trust and, beyond a single funded opportunity or project have really committed to working differently together? So there's, the 8 R's: assets, equity, investment, policy, relationships, sustainability, technology, and well-being that are the Forbes Fund's attempt at capturing the how behind, why people might be sharing metrics and moving work together in the right direction. As I shared, Fred is going to be speaking about the launch of our Global Leadership Lab today. And just as a quick, very abbreviated bio, I wanted to go into a couple of the priorities for Fred's work at the Forbes Funds, but longer term as well, since, before he was at Homewood Children's Village. So the first is building capacity of nonprofits. Second is collaboration through innovation. 3 is community empowerment, green technology and sustainability, interdisciplinary 2-gen approaches, and then transformative leadership development. Just some quick bullet points to his work and history prior to becoming president and CEO at the Forbes Funds. He was previously president and CEO at Homewood Children's Village, focusing on community development and youth empowerment. He created the Innovation Lab for nonprofits, specializing in revenue diversification and strategic collaboration. He has expertise in empowering at-risk populations and bridging knowledge gaps in energy reduction and environmental justice. He developed programs in green technology, sustainability, and STEM education. He's experienced in interdisciplinary team building and systemic change. He has a diverse professional background, including roles as Dean of Students, teacher, and consultant prior to joining the nonprofit sector. And he's a member of the Club of Rome, Nexus Global, Royal Society of Art, Manufacturing, and Commerce. So with that, Fred, I'm going to turn it over to you to really open the call and get us going with the exciting news about the Global Leadership Lab. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us this morning.
Thank you. It's exciting to be on with everybody. Good morning. Happy tax day. Hopefully everybody got their taxes in today. Today, the Global Leadership Lab is really an outcome of many of the activities we've undertaken the past 6 years. We're targeting, in particular, when you hear us talk about our work, we really look at our work through a lens of what exists already in the ecosystem, what is pushing particular agenda items. And so recently, at a meeting at the governor's mansion, the governor made mention again, and so did the lieutenant governor, about an investment in small businesses across Pennsylvania. So we use that as a framework to kind of lift up, like, how might that work be assessed, moved forward, enhanced by different metrics that exist now and in the future? How might we grow the sector's interest around machine learning, data scientists, business intelligence, cybersecurity, and such? So when you start looking at the activity that's taking place, we launched on March 19th the launch of a partnership to really explore how we might build a global leadership lab using transformational leadership as a construct with the Eastern Minority Suppliers Development Council. And we had the president and CEO on, Brian, and his chief executive VP, Trishina. And we basically start to push this narrative about how can we move forward with this particular approach. And so we looked at the role of innovation that really drives systemic change, and in particular, how robotics and technology play a critical role in the life sciences and energy, in particular in the nonprofit ecosystem. And so for us, we always look at these inflection points. Once again, this is a macro level issue that has direct bearing on local application. And for us, as we move out of 2024 into 2025, we still have to address political division and armed civil unrest, the remnants of COVID, where we are with racial equity as an ecosystem, income inequality, and now we're moving into AI and machine learning. And so if you look at our trajectory, over the past 6 years, we've had direct bearing and activity in these areas, and we continue to push these areas as transformative opportunities for the nonprofit ecosystem to really take into account how to problem solve. We believe that no single organization can solve today's problems by itself. And through that construct, we have looked at and assessed 9 of the Fortune 500 companies in the region and looked at what their startup scale-ups are worth, estimated at $35.6 billion. And so the question remains, if we look at the nonprofit ecosystem, how is it aligned and linked to the emerging business constructions that exist in our region? And as you start looking at robotics, technology, artificial intelligence, how is that being looked at not just locally, but globally? And so when you start saying, well, what is the role of the nonprofits in this sector? We believe that the social impact of the human services organizations are critical, in particular to maintain some level of equality around racial equity in this lens. For us, what's critical is relationships. And so if you look at the work that Emily pointed out, or ROR, what's the return on relationships? For us, we've really drilled it down to the work of Covey and really looking at the speed of trust. There's 4 critical things that we think are instrumental in building positive relationships: integrity, intent, capabilities, and results. And we say this as not as an absolute, but this is a framework. I would say that none of this is relevant without courageous conversations. Even if you have this as a metrics, your inability to have the courageous conversations with folks really limits your ability to have concrete relationships that are from the ground up. And so when we think about this work, at least our work, we look at, for every dollar invested in the Forbes Funds, we have a $7 rate of return on capacity service in the ecosystem. And why is that important? Is because we have to make every investment more than money. most organizations don't have enough money to do everything they need. Building sustainable, authentic, regenerative relationships allow you to grow your capacity exponentially. In other words, to build strategic partnerships that grow your ability to provide services at a much deeper and more prolific level. This work is all predicated on our humanity-centered design work. We started with our human-centered design effort. And basically, the essence of this work is how do we listen and learn more as opposed to coming into a space with a preconceived notion of what should take place. And so we've launched 6 years ago calls for community coffees, which really was this notion of how can we go into a community and listen and learn and assess what they already have as assets and help them structure their assets in a way that we can do a gap analysis. And from that gap analysis, how might we consider investing in this particular community as a regenerative and I would say catalytic investment process, meaning that we stop just writing checks to people because they have a need. We really look much more deeply at organizations and what is their 1, 3, and 5 year interest, impact, and trajectory. And so when we think about this work, the Forbes Funds is in this 6 pivot, and let me define pivot very quickly. I mean, it's repositioning your organization to take the best shot that meets the challenges of that moment. And, as a result of COVID, it really shook us to our core, in particular, those organizations that did face-to-face business that had to move to a technology-driven framework. And so for us, our pivots over the past 6 years includes our pivot in 2018 when we restructured our grant making, partnered with the city of Pittsburgh to adopt the UN SDGs, as well as we did as an organization. We used those 2 frameworks to measure our grant making and impact, the social determinants of health as our local application, and we reverse engineered the outputs to the UN SDGs. In year 2, we partnered with the London School of Systems Change to enhance our dual framework, and we looked at 4 critical areas: micro, meso, macro, and global, meaning at the smallest level, person-to-person engagement, community organization engagement, governmental engagement, and global engagement. And we created a vertical and horizontal assessment tool to help us pinpoint within those 4 constructs where there was lag and opportunity to make strategic investments in organizations that maintain some continuum within the 5 constructs of the social determinant of health. And basically, we started to look at preconception to career as the continuum and identify what organizations existed within each of those continuums, the 5 continuums that created a life cycle. And our focus was to how do we enhance those life cycles. Year 3, we partnered with Nora Bateson and the International Bateson Institute and began to look at how we build a post-COVID framework. Nora's original work helped us launch the training where 30 people from around the country and the world participated in Warm Data Labs. At the conclusion of Warm Data Labs, shortly after that, COVID hit, and we partnered with Nora to create People Need People and launched that. We had 42 2-hour sessions with a cross-sector of community leaders and stakeholders to ascertain what they needed as a result of COVID. And as a result of that, we purchased 50 Zoom licenses to help people navigate that and began to ramp up our work at the Forbes Funds University, which was online tools to increase the professional acumen of the nonprofit ecosystem. In year 4, we looked at this notion of what happened or didn't happen as a result of COVID. At least from my perspective, what I witnessed was a lot of organizations that kept saying, I can't wait till we get back to normal. And for me, that was a problem because I didn't know what normal they were referring to, given that over 1 million Americans had lost their life as a result of COVID or some correlation. And we have yet to this day to track their impact. And so what we've done is plug and play. We've hired people and put them in positions to fill an opening without really understanding the context of the role those folks play, which is why the work we do around human-centered design and humanity-centered design is important, because it moves away from the transactional nature of filling a spot to the transformational nature of fulfilling the organization's mission by strategic collaboration. And so for us, we began to push this notion, how do we create co-created ecosystems where high-performing organizations and institutions sought out each other strategically to reduce the duplication of effort and increase their effectiveness and efficiency. Our fifth pivot was taking the work that we've learned post COVID and really instead of talking about what doesn't exist, we created something called the Transformational Leadership Cohort, where we targeted emerging leaders and trained them in the transformational leadership constructs, much of which derives from Covey's speed and trust model, as well as other principles from global entities that really explored how do you build sustainable partnerships and relationships. And you guys know very clearly we've talked about our use of the social determinants of health and the UN SDGs as our dual framework. And then we started to explore, well, what is our global collaboration and what's the highest good? And so we began to do work around the world. We partnered with the group of folks around the world that really represented. One group was the Department of the Future. 2 years ago, they were part of the host group that launched our first international anti-racism wireframe cohort work, in which we had 158 people come to the original launch and 75 people from 43 companies in 5 countries participate in a 10-month journey to really explore going beyond DE&I to look at organizational culture, blind spots, and implicit bias. And that work really launched us into our current pivot, our sixth pivot, which is this notion of generative AI. And so we created this tool in partnership with Mad Labs, using large language models, looking at proprietary data, reviewing videos online and internally, and creating ways that we track incoming organizational requests. And really, in essence, to reduce the kind of seat time people have doing transactional works for their organization, to really create more space for people-to-people engagement that allows them to also look at technology to help them identify trends and look at opportunities for new resources and tools that also allow them to create supportive partnerships, but put humans back at the center of the interaction. And so this work also is part of our sixth pivot as a tandem is the launch of EOS, our entrepreneur operating system, in which we're helping organizations explore their vision, the people that they have on their team, how they're using data to look at how they should move, the use of what issues they're looking at, and what processes they're taking to resolve those issues, and then how are they building traction. And so this is something we've launched in our sixth pivot along with Skilly, our generative AI tool, to really move the sector more aggressively towards levels of self-sustainability. And we always focus in 30, 60, and 90-day increments to create time to help organizations, including ourselves, assess emerging opportunities while also assess trends that are occurring in the ecosystem. And so today is the launch of our Global Leadership Lab. And basically, what we're looking to do is help organizations explore and create climates in which culture and that focus authentic, humanistic lifestyles and workspaces exist. The workplaces and spaces that people create have to reflect the culture that exists, not just in Pittsburgh, but how those cultures shift and augment when you get outside of Pittsburgh, when you get outside of the state, when you get outside of the country. Our ability to have agile and adaptive tools is critical to our long-term sustainability. We're also looking at cultural boundaries and how people accept, acknowledge, and participate and pay attention to differences. And this is some pioneering work that Dr. Sheffield has pioneered over the last 20 years that's important to look at, especially through his model Excel. And then how do we develop leaders and linguistically helping them speak in behavioral ways that support the concept values and create actions. And, this past Friday, I was a speaker at the Humanities Conference, and it was interesting that a lot of the leaders in that conference spoke around, they had courageous conversations. And when people started saying, okay, what's the action? What's next? There wasn't any clear delineated responses, which upset a few people because what some of the stakeholders said in the meeting on Friday was some of the problems we're dealing with today, we've been dealing with for 40, 50, and 60 years. They're not new. We don't need additional research on the problems. We need new actions. And so how do we move from the theoretical to the metaphysical? And that's the essence of the Global Leadership Lab, is to really take local applications and build those applications up so that they have global capacity, and to use Pittsburgh as a platform, as a framework, because of its global attention, to really harness the assets, skills, gifts, and talents of the nonprofit ecosystem, in particular in a human service delivery system and beyond, to explore individually each organization's ability to have some level of global impact. Why is that important? As you guys know, almost every philanthropic center in the city of Pittsburgh has underwent a strategic plan. In that strategic plan, they have come up with new ways to measure their own internal operations, as well as organizations that they fund operations. Those organizations that cannot put their finger on measurement tools that you're using and its impact are going to have a very difficult time getting resources. Secondly, if you look at over the last 10 years, what has happened in the last 2 years is a number of nonprofits have shifted their work, as well as philanthropy has shifted their work to really serve the sector differently. And so this notion of organizations, in particular at the nonprofit level, being 100% grant driven is a problem, because there's always been a challenge for the nonprofit ecosystem to keep pace with the shifts within philanthropy. But as resources got tighter as a result of COVID and the recovery of COVID and the influx of resources that came in through the federal government, what we saw was many organizations restored organizational practices that were to pre-COVID, but didn't pivot. They didn't come up with new business models. And so as a result of that, because the ecosystem has shifted, a lot of organizations are not prepared to be more agile, iterative, and meet the challenges that are confronting those organizations and communities. And so when we think about what is transformational leadership and the difference between transactional and transformational, very clearly, transactional leadership is more event-oriented, task-focused, outcome-driven project completion. It says it checks the box and it completes these specific things. Transformational leadership is looking at how do we take the assets we have to design a system that's regenerative? How do we look at the process as the prize? And in doing so, how do we promote agile and iterative organizations and institutions and leaders that are more conscious and aware of the actions that's required, that are grounded in the circumstances, not just in their community, but in the world? How they leverage culture, how they unleash the power of their team, how do they navigate challenges, and then how do they accelerate growth? This is a circle of activity that requires a different kind of leader. And so when we think about what it takes to look at, what we're looking at as the three critical frameworks for this pivot, it's the inclusiveness that organizations exhibit by how they're practicing diversity, looking at historical inequities, and looking at how do they empower leaders on a global level. What's their adaptive leadership skills? Are they using EOS or some other entrepreneurial mindset that allows them to be competitive in the global economy? And are they looking at transformational philosophies that really transform their organization in a constant way that they're learning and leading through multiple ways of doing that work? From an innovative standpoint, are they collaborative? Do they look at cross-functional teams? And the main thing here is, when you understand a solution to a problem, what's your ability to scale up? And so a lot of philanthropists are looking at organizations to do great work and say, okay, how is that scalable? Like, can it scale up? And the challenge that I see is there's a lot of organizations that do incredibly important work, but it can't get scaled up, because to be scaled up, they either have to have a tremendous amount of resources pushed into their infrastructure, and or have strategic partners that have alignment around mission, vision, goals, and outcomes, share metrics and accountabilities, and are willing to have courageous conversations. Now, we are concerned that those organizations that continue to operate independently may have some level of success, but it will not have the same manner of influence that it would through a cross-sectoral set of partners, given the stress and shocks to our ecosystem. And so when we think about creating a regenerative platform, we're looking at how do we use predictive analytics, look at strategic insight, clarity, finances and economics, the role of technology, how are we looking at market intelligence and making an analysis. And so when we start looking at the practical application, like what are some critical things organizations need to exhibit is, have they looked at diversifying their revenue streams? And if so, what's the current makeup of that? Two, have they done scenario planning and given the stresses and shocks to their ecosystem, what's their primary, secondary, and tertiary goals if they need to pivot? Three, we saw this as a big issue during COVID is there weren't succession plans. And so when a lot of leaders left for various reasons, a lot of organizations thrusted new leaders in those positions without a clear pathway. And, even in the funding world, people fund people they trust and believe in, as well as the organization's ability to deliver. And so a lot of organizations lost funding just because they shifted leaders. And so having a succession plan allows philanthropy and other organizations to see that somebody is in the seat and a part of the potential pivot if and when that leader moves on. There is no loss energy within the organization, and there maintains clarity of sight what that organization is about as they look at the succession planning process. And then lastly, how many organizations really have produced operating reserves? And so Skilly is a tool that really helps us think about that work. And then our call to action is really around, are people really creating the frameworks that they're using AI to move this along, and not just from a local application, but from a global one. And so when we think about the state of the economy, emerging opportunities, what does success look like for organizations as they consider these challenges? And in many instances, most of the organizations we talk to haven't even thought about this. They're just in survival mode. And so why I'm saying this and why we're having this call is that we get hit with those questions. People will call us and say, hey, I need 150,000 by Friday or I have to lay off my staff. And I'm like, well, you knew that before Monday, right? And so we can't, we don't react like that, number one. Number two, we make strategic investments in organizations that we believe are tackling the challenges within the ecosystem and have thought through partners that, and this is a challenge for most organizations, if there's somebody that does something better than you, why not partner with them to do that work where you can focus more on what you do better so that there's continuity between the two? A lot of people try to do everything. And even, for us, we get accused of doing everything. And I would say, what we should be accused of is shining light on what's needed, which is a lot, and driving systemic change through pragmatic activity that we feel like we can add value to in the ecosystem. And where applicable, we partner with people to do stuff better than us. But that's based upon the four characteristics: integrity, intent, capabilities, and results, right? People who talk well but can't deliver affect organizations' flow rate. And as a result of that, organizations that do that work extremely well have to tighten up their ability to do that work by themselves, even in partnership. And that just creates a block between the scalability of the organization. And why am I saying this? Well, our team has experienced this the last 4 years. And it's a constant challenge for my team and I, because I have a lot of courageous conversations with leaders who think about what's needed for the future, but can't act with due diligence to make that happen organizationally. And it's no knock on the organization or the leaders, it's about capacity. And the essence of the Forbes Funds is building those kind of capacities that allow organizations to pivot in the 21st century global economy with assets and skills that transform that organization's ability to function at the highest level in conjunction with where the city of Pittsburgh is and global opportunities.
Thank you, Fred. I was gonna say, I feel like everybody just like take a deep breath, digest. I typically have that response after hearing these presentations. It's okay. But so I'm gonna ask a couple of questions for you to respond to, and I see a couple of folks on the call. Please feel free to jump in and come off mute and ask some questions as we get into the Q&A. But I think my biggest question is, like, how you've talked about this as a global leadership lab, right? How do we translate this model and how its potential to become global and bring in new partners? Like, how do those two things work together to put it in the context of, the title of this new initiative?
That's a great question. So the original Global Leadership Lab has 6 countries it's partnering with to do this work, as well as some university partners. And the goal really is, how do we cultivate leaders that think and function globally but have a local application? And how do we build their skill sets up around the world to see problem solving as a universal responsibility for restoring humanity in the sector versus an individual one, right? That shift requires us to think so differently about our work and to be more vulnerable and fully present as leaders that in many instances we're not prepared to do or have practiced. And so the cohorts that we create produce that kind of space where people can trust. We have similar experiences and journeys. And I could say that what led up to this work is the work we've been doing with First T since last year, where we've trained up 45 emerging leaders in transformational leadership, using golf as a metaphor for complexity theory. And why is that important? It's important because it's easy to tell a leader what they need to do. It's harder for them to understand for the first time how to do that. And so when you're in a cohort with other leaders, it gives you the platform to ask courageous conversations with people that share the same challenges that you have. And as a result of that, when trust is restored and created, then people can actually collaborate more strategically and pragmatically. But what we've seen as a tangible, measurable outcome of this work is a lot of leaders have went deeper into building personal relationships beyond the professional ones that has girded the ability to collaborate more organically. And that was a wish and dream that we had, but I didn't know if it was ever going to happen. And so I'm excited because some of the members that have participated in the transformational leadership cohort, Liz Kaplan is on. She's one of our coaches. And so if I said to you, we do a series of weeks of training at 7 o'clock in the morning with First Tee. Liz is our female golf coach. She works with our other male golf coach. And we actually train people in how to play golf. And if people might say, what in the world does this have to do with leadership? And I would say, it's the most tangible thing I know to help a leader. Number one, every shot you hit in golf requires you in a split second to pick a club that's required to get you closer to the hole. So if you're 80 yards out, you might use your sand wedge, and then you're in the rough, and the lie that you're having causes you to have to hit down on the ball differently than you would on a flat surface, and it's in the grass. So you might need to club down another club. If your 80-yard club is your sand wedge, you might need to go to your attack wedge. But in that second that you grab the club, that's all you have. It's a group behind you that's ready to go. It's people in front of you getting off the green. So it teaches you rapid prototyping as a leader. And then the beauty of golf is you might hit a terrific shot, get on the green in 2 and 3 putt or 4 putt. So you can never get too happy with a great shot, or you might be in a rough and par because you were able to get up and down in a way that you didn't think was possible. And so what golf teaches you is discipline of staying the course, don't get too high or too low on any shot. And the goal is to, get the ball in the hole. So what do you have to do in that moment to read the greens? Now, why is that important? Reading the greens is like reading your staff. If I put this ball this way, is it going to go to the left or to the right or straight in? Is my staff on board with what I'm talking about? Is my board on board with what I'm talking about? Even if I think it's the right thing to do, how am I ensuring that they're on board? And so golf creates this level of camaraderie to me that really pulls people together in a way that thinks about the human experience. And because of the camaraderie that you end up building with people, you get to actually see their kind of leadership style. They're aggressive, or they I would call calculating, or do they play it safe? Like if somebody plays with me, they'll be like, this dude take a lot of risks, right? I take a lot of risks. That's my personality. Without risk, there's no reward. But as I'm getting more and more into golf, I'm realizing, okay, Fred, don't take a risk on this hole right here. The sand trap's in the front. Hit to the left, pitch up. par, right? Go for par. I love golf too from a clearing my mind perspective as a leader. I'm often bombarded with so many challenging thoughts on a given day and week. Golf allows me to unplug for a few hours and walk 8 to 10 miles on the golf course. So I get my mental health in, my physical health in. And so when I look at golf, I see it as a refuge to really transform the human experience. And I've been pushing a lot of emerging leaders to play golf. Some have loved it and taken it up, others are like hesitant. But I say this because 5 years ago, when I got invited to meetings with congressmen and senators, you got selected to play with those folks based upon how well you play golf. If you're trying to have decisions be made with folks who are in the seat, you can't even have that conversation if you ain't in the grouping with them or close to them. And so it's another way that you build a different skill set with people who still use the golf course as a place to have conversations around decision making of the political nature, resource nature, and other. And so golf is not just this thing that I'm pushing as a possible transformational process for leaders. It's also a tactical one. As you've looked around, I would say the last 5 years, there's been a preponderance of organizations doing fundraisers using golf. And you meet people that you don't know who are in key positions of organizations and institutions on the golf course. And I dare say that there's no other space that you can actually build a relationship with people for 2 to 4 hours than you can playing golf.
Thank you, Fred. And as you were going through the pivots, and I love the basketball picture with that on your presentation. It seems like there are all of these pieces that have been developed, right, for the past 5 years that are kind of finally fitting into place with this Global Leadership Lab, where people can pick the type of capacity building, personal or for their organization, that is going to be most transformative for them. And as you're talking about the metaphor of golf as a leadership skill, I saw a couple of comments in the chat about chess being as beneficial as well, because Ashley's on the call today. Good morning, Ashley. And thinking about how you have to be constantly iterating and doing so live and being really flexible, and that it's a skill set that you have to build. Putting that in context of the things that leaders of nonprofit organizations are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. At the summit, Vu talked about like fundraising Sudoku, right? Like that's a challenge in terms of financial diversification. But you mentioned succession planning and healthy operating reserves as two things that nonprofits struggle with, and that we get requests from folks all the time. How prepared are organizations to actually execute succession plans? And then what percent of organizations would you say have operating reserves at the level that they need to be, presently?
I would say that 5% or less of organizations have substantial operating reserves, which is scary. Um, and I think from the standpoint of, how do you build your team's ability to be at this level? It really requires organizations to really do a critical analysis of what we deliver, right? And I say this to my team all the time, like, there's enough, and please don't take this the wrong way, anybody out there. This is not a personal attack on anybody, but we have to differentiate when there's the social good that the church does and the strategic good that philanthropy and nonprofits do. Sometimes we merge those things together. In my opinion, this is my opinion, nonprofit ecosystems should be having two tiers to it. It should have a tier where they hire the best people to execute the work, and they should have another tier where they lift up people who are moving from surviving to thriving and create platforms for them to participate in the 21st century global economy. That's a different mindset than helping everybody. Like, it's about what are you really good at that you could do where you could transfer a skill set in somebody from surviving to thriving, and how is that applicable as you look at the 21st century global economy opportunities? And so to me, those kind of things are important. The third is, inside an organization, are we capable of saying this one thing that we do could probably generate revenue? This other thing over here, is something that we do because it's in our mission. This other thing over here is a cost loss center, right? Are we willing to look at that and go, do we need to do that? And is somebody doing that better than us that we could partner with? And the real challenge is people like to hold on to stuff that has historical value but don't have real application today, as opposed to like, how are we relevant today without mission drifting? And how do we maintain the integrity of our work as we move forward?
Thank you. And speaking of great partners and transformative leaders, I see Camille, you have your hand raised. Feel free to come off mute.
Ooh, hello. Oh, hi. Hi,
We can
everybody.
hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so here I think is where my I don't know if it's confusion, but I think a lot of it is figuring out how to accommodate all of those things. Right. So we are talking about having operating funds, we're talking about having a reserve, and we're talking about having enough money to be able to take care of like that social impact that we want to do while also doing the work that generates revenue. How in the world are we supposed to do that? That's really the question. Like, it's a lot of things. And then realistically, just to give us an understanding of how to manage our expectations, how large of an organization should we expect to be before we can even get to that point? How long should we be in operation? How many staff members? I think those are like the really tangible questions that need answers that can help frame what it is, at least give us an understanding of if we're on the right path, or are we shooting for the stars with some of our goals, or are we exactly where we need to be for the size that we are. I think that's kind of the hard part, is figuring out if we are operating efficiently and effectively, or if we are kind of on a road to burnout, and that's the scary part.
Thank you. I would say three things. One is you should have, if you haven't completed our assessment tool that helps us determine how and where you might be regarding that particular challenge. Two, Camille, I would say the greatest challenge that every nonprofit probably on this call and around our ecosystem is we have a tendency to focus from a program management perspective versus a project management perspective. And so there's nothing wrong with that if you want to scale down, right? If you want to stay in a certain sphere of influence, say you want to, in your geographical area, you want to have an impact of 500 people, right? Then you might look at, well, what ratio do I have within my organization to have a sustained impact on 500 people to feed my ecosystem, right? Is that a 10-to-1 ratio, 20-to-1 ratio? You have to figure that out. That's one model, right? Where you own the process, it's in-house, it's driven and delivered by what you do. The model that we've been pushing the last 6 years is moving from program management to project management, meaning that you can serve with 8 people, 2,500 organizations, right? How can you do that? By strategically partnering with organizations while you concurrently build the sector's ability to react to challenges to the ecosystem in a way that meets the challenges of the organization's delivery system without costing you additional time and energy. But the issue here is who's managing the collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we've been pushing project management as a skill set, in particular within the Forbes Funds University, which means before we even get to there, the first thing I said is critical is for every organization to do an assessment and say, do we have enough resources? Do we have operating reserves? And so a good standard to start off is, do you have 6 months of operating reserves for your organization? That's a good starting point. You want to get to a year, given what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get there? When you make requests to funders and they provide services and say these are unrestricted funds, we peel off a piece of that every time we get funding to go to operating reserves. Secondly, we've created a docket of businesses that allow us to generate revenue that's unrestricted, that allows us to fill the gaps, organizational and things we need that might have been tapped to create operating reserves. And that's why I'm saying to people, like, if something that you're doing, somebody wouldn't pay for, is that good of a skill set, you got to kind of ask yourself, like, should I be doing that? And I'll differentiate the two. Your core mission is to do X. That's what you do. But to make X more profitable and applicable, most of us build a tool to make X more acceptable to a larger portion of folks. Does that tool generate revenue for people to buy it, to invest in it, to get to the next landing point? And that's what we've kind of been, I think, focused on becoming somewhat good at, which is like, if you look at Skilly as our generative AI tool, it's an example of if you use technology to reduce your staff's time that they had to do tasks, and it increases their ability to do face-to-face relationship development and things like that, how does that change your organization's ability to do more with the same amount of folks? The third is having a sense of the plan. So when I came on board 6 years ago, I told the board and the team, we want to have in 5 years, 100% of the end. There was 10,000 nonprofits at the time in Southwestern PA. We bid out 2,500 a year, knowing that there would be an influx. We looked at the role of GPMP in our core program areas, and we made a distinct framework for our work. We will focus on 2,500 organizations across our internal ecosystem to do one-to-one B2B kind of activity. And then we will provide information and resources to the entire ecosystem. And so we had two influxes of activity taking place. One is like the Call for Community Solutions, GPMP Summit. It's open to everybody. It's information for everybody. And then when you look at MAGS, EIR, GPMP's advocacy and policy work, those are specific things that we are providing as a service to increase organizations' ability to do their work more sound, more collaboratively with metrics, right? As organizations use these tools, they become more proficient at them. And so what you see us doing over the past 6 years is saying, let us help you first analyze organizationally, do you have the right resources and are they being applied in the right place? And do you have a good sector of resources coming in from diverse stakeholders? Two, when you look at your work, is it transforming the sector or is it just treading water? And so as an organization, the hardest thing for you to say is like, what we're doing that I love is not working.
Mm-hmm.
That's the hardest thing. Like, and it's like, you know, are you willing to let it go to do something different, or can you deconstruct it and say, why isn't this working? I thought it would work, but it's not. Like, what's missing, right? And that's why we go back to using Covey speed of trust, because I don't think there's any organization that has hired people that they want that is not functioning well, for the most part. I think the issue is when you take what you're doing individually and you say, I want to grow it and I want to collaborate. And foundations are fun to support collaborations, but what most of us have done is created these, I would not call them fake collaborations, I would call them pseudo collaborations where people agree to work together to get money, as opposed to working together to create something better. Right? To create something better, that means I'm gonna have to be honest and say, do I need to have the same team of people I have? Do you need to have the same team of people? Do we have the right board members? Do we need to scale back? Do we need to have one organization versus two? If we have two, what is the distinct difference between the two that when we work together, we actually merge and our collective capacity builds more than it does independently? That means we both have to be accountable to each other in ways that some of us are not comfortable with. And so to me, that's it. The third is, what does, and this is important, is even when you have a great idea, even when you think you're on point with it, what is the climate for change? Like 2 years ago, DE&I had a climate. Today it does not. Do you know how many organizations hired a DE&I expert from around the country and the world who now they don't even have a job or they're struggling to figure out their value, right? And so understanding the climate externally is critical. And also as a leader, we have to be able to forecast like what may be happening that I might need to be pointing some of my activity towards that may not be popular, which is why we're in our sixth pivot. Like we pivot based upon not what we did for the last 42 years, but what's required today. And a lot of times people don't get it until 18 months from now. They're like, oh man, that made a lot of sense. Our concern is the people that it makes sense to don't need extra help. They already understand this makes sense. The people who need it don't even recognize it's needed. And so we have been really trying to build a bridge to say, if you don't get on board with some of this stuff, you may not be around.
Got it. So I need to go fill out the needs assessment.
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
I'd say we can link it in the chat, but I appreciate that question so much because, like, in just that conversation between the two of you, there was mention of like community level metrics as well as organizational metrics and how you have to track both. It
Right.
takes a, I mean, it takes a lot of capacity to do that work, right? To have like a realistic understanding of where you fit as like a microcosm of this broader ecosystem, but then also have all of those pieces that you're accountable for in both places. And so when Fred talks about like, we can't approach this from everything is on our shoulders, not from a place of, ego or wanting to take responsibility or that sense of like, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself, but like genuinely breaking down that way of thinking to build trust among multiple like-minded leaders, organizations with similar missions, and changing the way that the nonprofit sector itself does work. Because traditional capacity building is like that water treading piece. And then, I mean, I have this conversation all the time with GPNP members that come to the Forbes Funds looking for like a specific thing. And then it turns out that there's all of these different ways of partnering and moving differently that are actually more beneficial longer term, but it takes like that switch to flip and actually commit to working differently. Really quickly, I'm going to pause, and Bree, if you wouldn't mind launching the poll, because speaking of transformative work, this is how we kind of do a litmus test every week and see if the calls that we're hosting are helpful, and at what cadence you all would like to hear from us on specific topics and issues. So please respond to the poll that you see pop up on your screen. And with that, Fred, I'm going to ask one final question that relates to the golf cohort and like that, all of the balance of the transformative leadership. What are like the top two things that somebody should prioritize in their movement from thinking about being a transactional leader and the things that they've prioritized to actually thinking about that more transformative work?
I think the two biggest things are, can a person look at their work and embrace diversity of the people who's helping them execute the work? It's very easy to work in homogenous groups, and Google did an analysis years ago, and they did analysis on cross-functional teams versus homogenous teams. And homogenous teams were able to make decisions quicker, but they didn't have the same impact of cross-functional teams. Cross-functional teams took longer to get to solutions, but they were more systems-based than specifically based upon the homogenous group's focal point. And so that's one. Two is this notion of creating systems, right, that have local to global impact. And so I'm not suggesting that people overnight say, I want to go global. It's really like, what am I delivering that has the potential to have local and global impact? And I say this to you to say, I had no real idea until I started traveling around the world and seeing everybody has some version of a difficult community that they're trying to serve. Everybody has some version of ghettos and disenfranchised people. Everybody has governments trying to do what they think is best and not connecting with people. And so one of the, when I was a keynote speaker in Aqaba, when I got inducted into the Club of Rome and the RSA, it was really enlightening to me that people were interested in our solutions. They thought they had global application. Well, we didn't arrive at that point overnight, right? We work with people around the world. When I talked about year 2 pivot, year 3 pivot, year 4 pivot, we're talking about we work with global partners who really helped us understand that if we were thinking about a solution that had local to global application, here's some other considerations to take into account. And so we plan to do work like that. And also what we did was every time we did something, we invited global partners to participate so that they could have a sense of like what we were thinking and how we function. And through those engagements, it allowed us to grow partnerships. And these are challenging because our partners have different global cultures and they don't function, they don't have American-centric approach. They have their own cultural approach. And so even when something's right in your face, like, oh, this should happen, culture plays a role in moving the way that that happens. And the greatest challenge for us, to me, as leaders, if we've been inculcated that stuff should go this specific way, we don't build adaptive leaders, right? Because we're like, we got to do this. We got to be the best at this in America to do it like this and make money or have impact. Yes, that's true. But to make it more inclusive of other people, both locally and globally, how might that work need to be different? How might it need to roll out differently than how it's currently rolling out? And a lot of us don't have practice doing that. And that's what we do with the labs is, right, how do you create safe places to have that practice to really test the validity of your idea, and not just the validity, but its application?
Yes, I saw like exactly what you just said. Hannah put radical vulnerability in the chat because nonprofits are not conditioned, nonprofit leaders, I should say, are not conditioned to like accept failure because it means a loss of funding, a loss of all the things that systemically keep us, thinking and operating this way. So I mean, that takes a lot of trust and having a network of strong partners that are also committed to transformative leadership to do, which I mean, yes, that's tough. But thank you so much, Fred. Thank you for your question, Camille. I appreciate that, especially the tactical, like, what are the things I do next direction. I'm gonna switch gears really quickly to share the public policy update. I promise it's short today because I know we're at 10:58. And then Fred, I'll turn it back over to you in just a second to close out the call. So really quickly, this Thursday is our fourth Public Policy Committee meeting of the year, April 4th or April 18th. And the purpose of these committee meetings is changing a little bit from that, educational, having a speaker who's an expert on one thing, to more of the mobilization that we're moving into as a purpose for GPNP. So having not one subject matter expert, but folks across environment, education, housing, broadband, workforce, mental behavioral health, all speaking about what are the top priorities for organizations that are focusing on that work, and serving as a place to call in nonprofits that may be smaller, that may not be advocating or lobbying yet. They're kind of early onto that work or don't necessarily know the best way to do it, and figuring out where they fit along those other policy objectives across the sector. This past Tuesday, I was in Harrisburg with the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations, so just wanted to provide a little bit of a retrospective for GPNP members and members of the ecosystem. There were 4 asks and conversations that we had with elected officials, all surrounding the issue of nonprofit workforce development and building up nonprofit leaders and building their capacity. One of the key statistics that was shared, courtesy of PANO, was that 84% of Pennsylvania nonprofits are reporting vacancies in their workforce. And of those vacancies, 87% are in the direct service delivery areas. So when we're talking about the needs of the most vulnerable populations across the state of Pennsylvania, there are really difficult decisions that organizations are having to make. And the ask is for greater capacity building support from the government to capacity building organizations like PANO, like the Forbes Funds, who are providing those kind of like 30,000-foot view of the sector, and hoping to address those issues collectively. The second is providing education and support around small games of chance legislation. A lot of nonprofits use small games of chance to raise money at events in person, yes, but also virtually. During COVID, there were restrictions on virtual small games of chance that were lifted just by nature of not being able to be in person as much, but those have gone back into effect. And so making sure that, one, nonprofits are aware of that, but two, how do we change that to remove a barrier to be able to raise money for our organizations? Asking elected officials to join the Pennsylvania Charitable Nonprofit Caucus, because that's the through line between small nonprofit organizations in each of their districts, and being a voice to address needs and really raise those issues at the state level. And then finally, a resolution for the Legislative Budget and Finance Committee to conduct an economic impact study looking at the impact of nonprofit organizations, because during COVID, we were really the social safety net, providing services to folks, changing complete like mission and scope of organizations to meet local needs when folks are really hurting. And so looking at beyond hiring 15% of the Pennsylvania workforce, which is more than manufacturing, what are the economic impacts of nonprofit organizations? And working to get an accurate portrayal of the value that we provide to the sector. And finally, a couple of upcoming dates. Tomorrow is the last day to request a mail-in ballot or absentee ballot for the primary election, and the primary election is on April 23rd. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. A couple of resources that'll link to other sites locally include League of Women Voters, Pump, Jefferson Regional Foundation, and vote.pa.gov, and also Spotlight PA if you're looking for a day of voter resources and information. And also, information about what each of the candidates on the ballot is going to look like for you and some of the things that they support, so you can be educated going into the primary election. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm going to skip through those because you know that. And a couple of upcoming speakers include an Earth Day discussion next Monday, because it's April 22nd. And then finally, a presentation from the Southwest PA Regional Hub. We had a great conversation, Olivia and I, with them a couple of weeks ago, and they'll be joining us to talk about some of the exciting work coming out of that hub. Thank you, everyone. And Fred, I'll turn it back over to you to close out.
I would just like to thank everybody for being on the call. If you're interested in learning more, our transformational leadership cohort, the next one is May 1st in partnership with First T. It really puts you at the threshold of what we're talking about. And I would say that my team and I have created a platform to allow leaders in Pittsburgh to have a transformational experience and a pathway that moves them from practices of the past, as we move from a rust belt to a brain belt, to practices of the present and future. And this future is about building leaders that are inclusive in nature, global in scope, innovative in their approach. And I dare say that there's not many organizations that have those three focal points, that have them as a regenerative, ongoing process. We all have innovated, we all have pivoted, we all have looked at stuff. But what I'm suggesting is an ongoing way to do that, which is why we're in our sixth pivot as an organization. And it brings challenges, because people say, you don't do what you used to do. Yes, we still do our core work. That's always a question to me when people say, y'all don't do what y'all used to do. We've never deviated from our core work. What we've done is said, here's our core work. Here's the things we're going to add to make sure we tackle things that aren't falling into our core work. And we have to do a better job of communicating that. But we also have to have other people lift up the work that says, it transformed us. It made us better. And I get that a lot privately. People come to me and say, you forced us to look at stuff from a lens we didn't consider. But people need to say that publicly, because it really connotes that as a leader, I'm changing. Like, if people think I'm the same guy I was 20 years ago, then their likelihood of wanting to collaborate with me might be based upon how they work with me at the Kingsley versus how I'm at the Forbes Funds. And I'm not the same guy. I'm a different guy. And so nobody remains the same. There's a throughway, like we're either good, decent people by nature, or some of us do different things people might question, but there's a throughput, right? If we don't deviate to make sure that we're operating at the highest level through those throughputs, we could find ourselves running off a cliff unknowingly, because we got our head down doing what we think is best, which is what we see that a lot of you guys don't see when we get calls for help in the 9th hour. And we're like, well, you knew this was happening. Why didn't you get with us earlier? Like, we're not an emergency organization that can give you $150,000 by Friday. Like, we don't function like that. And so we like to think about, I'll close by this and say, we're more proactive than reactive. And so we really try to help people think through, what are the mitigating stressors and shocks that might impact your organization that you need to be aware of, or we can help you become aware of, and what skills can we build into your repertoire through our ecosystem that allows you to be more prepared and even on top of those kind of opportunities. And those of you who came to our launch in March, the luncheon for the Global Leadership Lab, and what we did was take what the governor said around supporting businesses, we linked that to technology, then we took it to a global partnership And it's basically a triangulation of a regenerative ecosystem where people are all invested in looking at this business model, how technology enhances that, how through that work it takes us global. And then we just keep building on the strength of that within that construct. And this, to me, it's a simple concept, but it does require trust in people's ability to deliver, which is why it's not for everybody. And so people have to really assess, like, am I willing to take this next step as a leader? And what does it require of me and my organization? And everybody got to own the stuff in their closet. And they have to be able to clarify with other people through their actions how they've become different as a result of that journey. So I want to thank everybody for being on this morning. It's been great. Hopefully, if there's any questions, comments, or concerns, you can get those to Emily. And thank you guys for being so patient with us this morning and giving us an extra 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.